Hello, welcome to Calumet Roundtable, the student-produced interview program from Purdue University. I'm your host, Lee Artz, and today I'm delighted to be joined by my guest, Dr. Samantha Joyce, who's an assistant professor at Indiana University South Bend. I should confess up front, we both have our PhDs from the University of Iowa, so it's nice to have you here. Dr. Joyce is the author of essays and books on telenovelas, representations of race and gender, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Her two books are Brazilian Womanhood and Primetime Telenovelas, and Brazilian Telenovelas and the Myth of Racial Democracy. I want to begin, Samantha, with telenovelas, because although in the US we watch soaps, and maybe if we watch Univision we may see a telenovela, but I'm just going to assume that our viewers don't know what a telenovela is and how it's the same or different from a soap. Maybe you could give us some.
Sure, and also how it's different from the current view of what a telenovela is, especially now that there's a show that's called Telenovela, making fun of telenovelas. But they are actually very respected in Brazil and usually Latin America as a serious programming. They're usually a primetime show, so you know it's the show that has attracted the most viewers, and therefore the commercials are the most expensive during the telenovelas. They last an average of 9 months, and then they always have a happy ending, followed immediately by a new telenovela.
Kind of like a mini-series. In the US, we've had mini-series where they'll last for months and then it will go away.
But like a prolonged mini-series, right? Because it's for 9 months, but it's also 6 nights a week. So it's Monday through Saturday. And they're usually about current topics, and they involve politics. So there is that degree of melodrama, but there's also a lot of real life issues going on, so it's not just drama.
Okay. They've often been said that telenovelas are about love, beauty, happiness, family, wealth.
Yeah, so there is the novel, right, aspect in there, of course. But the other thing I wanted to say is I think that you might sound a little crazy, but you could compare it a little bit to South Park in the US, because South Park tapes like 6 days before it airs, right? And with telenovelas, sometimes they tape that chapter on the day it airs. Yeah. And so that's another key characteristic, is that we say it's an open text, and so according to the audience's kind of responses to what's going on in the telenovela, they might change something. So the fate of the characters is never fixed. It's always open to a reinterpretation or reshooting. That's why sometimes in telenovelas you have like a ghost figure, or like the twin, because they want either the character or the actor back.
Well, I hope we can get to that, because that's one of my interests in telenovelas, is how well that they respond to audience needs. And the question for me is always, is it actually audience need, or is it a way of building an audience that can be more readily sold to an advertiser? But what you're saying is viewers can blog or call in, or they'll even do focus groups, and then depending upon what the audience seems to want, the writer will change the script to make sure that, because if we're watching 6 days a week, it has to be intense, and it has to be something that's going to be compelling. It can't just be the same.
Right. And there's a lot of emotional involvement. So if you're watching 6 nights a week for about an hour a night for 9 months, you feel like you know the characters, right? And you should have a say, because they're a little bit yours too,
like
or they're part of your family.
Binge watching now of on the weekend, they'll do binge watching on Netflix because they get involved with the characters. But
except they have no say, right?
Yes, well, not the same.
As far as their fate.
Yes, not the same. One of the things that you argue in to some extent in both your books, but in the second one, Brazilian Telenovelas and the Myth of Racial Democracy, that telenovelas are one of the ways that it popularizes the idea that there is equality or racial integration in Brazil. And again, for the sake of our viewers, I thought maybe we could just a very brief history of race in Brazil. I realize it's a long period, but...
Sure. So actually, traditionally, there was this view of Brazil being a racial democracy, right? And with this particular study that I did was saying the opposite, how this serves as an example as to how it is not a democracy. And so let me try to do the Twitter version of race. So Brazil and US have similar racial pasts in that we both had slavery and then the legacy of slavery. But in Brazil, there were never any legal barriers to equality. Like in the US, there was segregation, right? The whole separate but equal, those types of things. And also the key in Brazil was the fact that because the Portuguese came to Brazil to colonize, right? Mm-hmm. They did have sexual relations with Indians and the slaves. It was like a one-way thing, right?
Yeah,
I don't know how explicit I can be in your show, but I think you understand. But the overall view was that with the mixing, with the miscegenation, which is the term we use, then you kind of have everything equal, right? So you can't really say there are races. But that's the other aspect of the book, is the idea that with miscegenation, there was this idea of whitening, mm-hmm. or what we call branqueamento. And so while in the US, blacks and whites are divided by that one drop rule, in Brazil, it's really complicated because you say you are whitening through miscegenation, right? But race is not just about how you look. There's a lot of class issues involved. And so something that always gets people really surprised or puzzled is that a rich Afro-Brazilian can be seen as white as far as status and where he gets in life and just social acceptance.
On the other hand,
I don't know if that was very clear.
Oh, yeah, yes. I mean, I understand that there were actually more slaves in Brazil than in the United States during slavery. 40% of the slaves people from Africa were moved to Brazil, which is a huge part of the population because Brazil is also not as large as the United States. So the idea that you could segregate that part of the population through legal means or coercion probably just wasn't an option.
Right, and that was the other thing, how they became free, right? In Brazil, it came to a point where they had no option because of the runaway slaves starting
Yep.
the quilombos and their own communities. It was just unbearable at that point.
And up until recently, at least, I mean, from O Globo's early telenovelas tended to feature the whiter Brazilians, the coiffed Brazilians, the upper class that happened to be the European looking. Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, that is still true. And that's the other thing about my study was that telenovela was so different because it did have...
The one you're talking about, Duas Caras?
Yeah,
Two Hearts?
the racial.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Where the lead actor was a black man, right?
Right.
Yes, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
so that was different because he was the leading hero. He was identified as being the hero in the telenovela, and he was very much marked as being black and poor. And that's not the case. And that's not to say that since then that's changed, because it really hasn't. So it was just a very peculiar. That you will have the Afro-Brazilians as the main characters.
That's still not the norm. It's not, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like the U.S. with Hollywood having very few black actors, or even on sitcoms. There's a few black shows, but not. The strange thing for me is that Brazil is so racially integrated or racially mixed, although there's still sections of major cities that are primarily black and sections of cities that are primarily white, which is also class. But mm-hmm. The fact that the audience is so huge, it surprises me that it's taken this long for somebody like O Globo to recognize if you're only having white characters with the same Cinderella story, you're losing, 50% of your possible advertising audience? Is that Was that part of what you addressed in the book, or is that off topic here?
No, because it's not off topic, but it's more complicated than that. One is because when you identify white in a society as being everything you aspire to be, because it gives you access to status, to money, to education, then unfortunately, even if you're black, you aspire to be that, right? And
Well,
so there's that whitening. And then
Yes.
in regards to you're losing money to advertisers, not really. You could say yes and no. Depends on what you're advertising, because when you really think about it, yes, the majority of the population is black, but the majority of blacks are poor.
Yes.
So it has to do with buying power too.
Just one small thing, we're going to take a break shortly, but what was the name of the character in Duas Caras, the lead?
Evilásio.
Okay, and he was a black character. And am I right to say that he, what you were saying is the way to be white, the way to be successful was to aspire to this lifestyle. And I understand, again, I can't read Portuguese or hear it, so I have to rely upon translations of it. But
sure.
he basically was assimilated. He wanted to follow the rules. He did everything according, which is what made him more acceptable in his community. Is that true? I mean, he didn't maintain an African identity or...
Within the story?
Yeah. He tried to... he accepted, he ran for office, I understand. He was a successful businessman.
But he was clearly marked as black, though. He wasn't assimilating in any way. And that's why it was so controversial.
Okay. When you say the myth of racial democracy, maybe just a very short, so we can go to break and we'll have something to think about over break. What do you mean by that?
So the myth was based on the miscegenation aspect of it. So if we're all mixed, if nobody is really just black or white, then there's a democracy, right? We don't have to think about race. And while that was ideologically constructed, it also made sure that there wouldn't be any laws regarding integration or affirmative action or anything like that.
Because they weren't needed because we were.
Right.
And so how does the telenovela contribute to that?
So it contributed to the fact that, no, there is race. People are very clearly marked as black. And
in the telenovela.
But because it reflects reality, then it makes you think, well, then, I guess it's not a democracy.
Okay, this is complicated. We'll have to talk about it in a minute. But right now we're going to take a quick break. Calumet Roundtable will be right back. Welcome back to Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Lee Artz. My guest today is Dr. Samantha Joyce from Indiana University South Bend. And we're continuing our discussion on telenovelas and race and gender. And one of the things that you talk about is identity, and I guess we should recognize that you're from Brazil and you're Brazilian, which you were raised on telenovelas, so this is not unusual that you would study it. But having said that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the book in the second half of the program, but I wanted to put it in the context of Brazil, because telenovelas come from Venezuela, a lot of them are from Mexico on TV, Colombia, like Ugly Betty. But Brazil is considered the founding country through Globo TV, and I just thought it would be helpful if we had maybe a short synopsis of Globo and how it became as dominant as it is now.
Sure. So it has to do with, since the book talks about democracy, it has to do with the fact that Brazil hasn't always been a democracy, right? And it has to do with TV Globo's what we call a cozy relationship with the military regime, and the fact that they really work together as propaganda, but not clearly as such. So they had a lot of incentives because the military really wanted to tie in the whole country together ideologically. And so TV Global had a lot of help from Time Warner, and from the beginning they had access to know-how from the U.S., better equipment, and so that really solidified them as
The dominant, yeah.
yeah, and they are until today. And their TV Global is, in fact, depending on the source, the fourth largest network in the world. Although I just came across a source from last year that said second.
I guess it depends on what you count the exports, right?
Yeah.
How many versus how much they make.
And so actually from the start, Brazilians just really had a preference for local programming, and so they just really bet on telenovelas.
Well, they had a preference for local programming, and because TV Global had that cozy relationship, they were able to actually produce local programming that could attract huge audiences for their national ideology that the military wanted. So in that sense, telenovelas became is this true, the primary genre of TV Global, and it's one of the primary ways that you talk about what it is to be Brazilian?
Yes, so at any week, we have actually like 4 time slots, 4 telenovelas on TV Global. So
6 days
all
a
day
week.
long, you can just watch telenovelas.
Okay.
Which is interesting because soap operas in the U.S. are slowly dying, but they're still really strong in Brazil.
I would think that if we, again, I understand they're miniseries, but some of the shows that we in the U.S. would call dramas, like Madam Secretary or The Good Wife, I view those as what telenovelas are in essence. It's kind of a hybridizing the genre. It's not a soap opera, but it's not just a straight drama. It kind of blends some of the things that telenovelas offer to the audiences in Brazil and around the world. And there's many things we could talk about with telenovelas, but one of the things we want to talk about with your book is the telenovelas service or construction of race and representations of race and how it contributes to this myth of racial democracy. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about the book, and maybe as a segue you could share with us what some of the chapters are, maybe give us a summary or some of the ideas that you're presenting in the chapters.
Sure. So, as you said, the name of the book is Brazilian Telenovelas and the Myth of Racial Democracy. And so I use this very specific text, the telenovela, Duas Caras, to talk about how it is challenging this idea that Brazil is a racial democracy. Because it really is, very comfortable to say we don't need to worry about race if you don't feel it yourself. And so I took this particular telenovela for some of the reasons we have discussed, such as the main actor was described as the hero of the telenovela, and he was Afro-Brazilian. But what was really interesting to me was that there were very the depictions of racism were shocking. It was just impossible for the audience to just watch and not react to it. And so there were a lot of blatant dialogues, just think of the N-word, right? And things like that. And then people would react to it, but how
would the audience react? I mean, how do you know that people reacted?
And so we know for a few reasons. One is because a lot of other media, other than TV Global, and other than media specializing in telenovelas, were talking about racism, television, and what was said in this telenovela. So another first for this telenovela was that the writer, the author, was keeping a blog concurrently with the telenovela where he would react to the reactions from the public. So the public
could write into the blog? So
right.
And
he would answer about 130 clicks a day. And so it was just really crazy. And he was getting death threats. It was like the real thing was a telenovela. It was very dramatic. But and the other reason is there was this expression that became just part of the lexicon, which was, it was in the big blog, translated from deu no blogão, because people would talk about something and they said, it was in the blog, because that's how much people were participating with the telenovela through the blog and through other media. But I'll give you an idea of some of the chapters, because they really help to explain the book and what happened. Because what I'm looking at is what I call an open textual analysis. So I am looking at the text of the telenovela, the narrative, and by text with TV, we mean production elements, the text itself, what they're saying, how it's put together. But so I start with the introduction, doing a comparison between race in the US and Brazil, and so I call it And Let There Be White, because I'm also focusing on representations of race, like you talked about before. It's usually really white, right? The main characters are white and actually blonde with blue eyes. And then I talk about this whitening ideology, but chapter 3 is a really good example of the blatant dialogue that was used. And so this is an interchange between the heroine and the hero. And
is the heroine black? Is the heroine white?
So she's white,
and
right?
It's
and
his
he's
romantic
black.
interest.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Wow, and even in Brazil, it would be like.
So that was shocking, right? And so he calls her my little whitey, and she calls him my big delicious Negro. I mean, it was just outrageous. And then the other chapter it was in the big blog. And then I focus on social merchandising, which is also a key characteristic of telenovela, which is to approach a topic that is good for society and that hopefully will trigger social change.
Okay. What's a topic that's good for society? Because this is a dilemma for me when we talk about telenovelas and its openness and the ability to respond to the audience or the characters that make their piece and present positive images. Give me an example of what a socially progressive message that a telenovela is going to promote.
So they've done many different things. So this one was focusing on issues regarding racism, right? But in the past, traditionally it's associated with health. And so they do topics such as bone marrow transplant, for example, or they'll focus on a disability, Down syndrome, or family planning, things like that.
Social written big that has absolutely nothing to do with the government relations or politics or funding. I mean, it's not like they're addressing questions of race inequality or housing or employment. A question of Down syndrome is not something that you can say, well, that's the result of the 1% or the inequality in society, but if we make this contribution, we can fix that. So nobody can really question. I mean, nobody's in favor of not supporting solving an illness, for instance.
Right, but nobody is also in favor, meaning if you don't shine a light at it, then people don't discuss it and don't talk about it. And so this method is not credited with having a direct effect. What it does is it gets people to talk about it, and then things happen from there. So for example, there was a telenovela that was focusing on domestic violence. And so as a result, a real life result was that, for example, now women have a place where there's only women cops, and they can go and feel safe and report if they're being abused by a partner, for example. Or like laws, a lot of laws regarding people with disability that have been passed due to the fact that, oh, now we talk about it. So there's not a direct effect, but because it's part of the discourse, because everybody, in quote, is watching and is now thinking about it, and then there's news reports about it, shining a light at it, then you start thinking about it differently.
I like that. It's good. The book is Brazilian Telenovelas and the Myth of Racial Democracy, and that's the last book? Yes.
So far.
Yes. Well, the most recent book? Yeah, not
Yes.
the last book. One of the things that I don't know if we'll have time to talk about it, but one of the things I question is the TV Globo serving the military dictatorship and major industry in Brazil, and the question if they continue to do that now, under the guise of being responsive to audiences. But the topics, even the ones that you list, are not ones that really challenge the power structure or the structures of race or, for that matter, the structures of gender in society, because it doesn't really disrupt anything to say we're going to have a shelter for women. It doesn't disrupt anything if we have female cops, because we still have cops. It's not. It's more like, oh, Global continues its attempt or its role as building an ideology for what the Brazilian identity should be. Is that?
So they don't really decide. The telenovelas. So yes, they're there to make a profit, right? And I'm very explicit about that in this book, is that, yes, I'm not saying TV Globo is great. They're the solution to all our problems, which by all means they're not. But different types of representations, yes, they do disrupt the status quo, because it gives people, even by giving them visibility and identification, it is disruptive. TV Global gives a lot of leeway to the writers. So this is where we need to separate TV Global as the boss and telling people what to do from what in fact they can do. Because, and this is also in the book, writers have their agenda of what they think is a social problem that should be addressed. Okay. And TV Global gives them an opening to do it as long as they're successful. So it kind of goes around in a loop, right? And because they are very successful and they do garner sometimes 45 million viewers a night, then they do have leeway to talk about whatever they want, even though TV Global might not have that agenda themselves.
We need more leeway to talk about this too, but time clicks, and that's all the time we have for our program. So thank you, Samantha Joyce, for joining me today on Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Artz. Have a great day. We'll see you next time.